So in our last section, we're going to look at what happened after humans moved out of Africa and started adjusting, adapting to all these different environments around the world, and the important cultural changes that happened during that time. So we will need to look at the emergence of things like agriculture. So here are some kind of cave paintings that suggest that our ancestors very early on started exploring and exploiting local environments and started making changes that ultimately led to the emergence of agriculture. Here's some rough timeline that I took from a book by James Scott, but there are lots of other resources that seem to suggest a similar kind of timeline. So about 50 to 60,000 years ago, humans move out of Africa. Then it takes about 40,000 years before humans started to actually settle in specific places. And then it would take another 3,000 years before humans actually started domesticating plants and livestock, so animals. And this would continue for a couple of another 1,000 years, and about 3,000 later only would we see the emergence of permanent towns. So if you think about it, it is 6,000 years that passed between the first evidence that people started settling down in one specific location for some time of the year till we have permanent towns. 6,000 years. It's an incredible time span if you think about it. And one of the puzzling questions is, like today we live in cities, we live in towns, we live in these large areas with lots of humans together. Why did our human ancestors not catch on to moving together faster? What stopped them from adopting essentially a city lifestyle? And there are some very important factors we have to look at. The first one is, if you think about agriculture, you need to domesticate these plants. And if you look at our, like ancestral states of those for example, wheat, for example, as one of those founder crops, those were really tiny grains that would ripen at, like very uneven, or like very uneven time spans. And they, like if you would touch them, they would just um, fall to the ground, and it's really hard to harvest them. So these grains were too small. They ripened at, like different times of the year, so it was very difficult to collect, and then they would just shatter and fall to the ground. So at the same time, though, they provided some kind of extra nutrition that our ancestors may have used. So they might have, eaten something and then, like defecated and then started realizing, oh my God, there are these plants growing somewhere here. And over thousands and thousands of years, they may slowly have thought of, like collecting some of these seeds that seem to be a bit larger, like more, would ripen more evenly, or, like would, stick to the stalk, and would be easier or would not shatter immediately to the ground, so therefore would be easier to pick, and then slowly started cultivating them around areas where people would move through repeatedly. So for example, if we look at some of the evidence that we have from the Amazon basin, as humans moved into the Amazon basin, we think of the Amazon as this kind of huge natural land. But what we see now is the distribution of plants this um, in this jungle area is actually not random. So what we can find now is we find evidence that humans over the last thousands of years, so humans most likely moved into the Amazon basin about 20,000 years ago, maybe a bit later. They started managing the forest areas in specific ways. So they would clean out plants that would be not very useful from areas close to these camps that they would set up. They would purposefully grow some plants that would be useful, like some palm trees, and they would also cultivate slowly these palm trees, so prune them and make sure that very beneficial variants of these palm trees would grow in specific areas. And this probably happened over thousands of years for our ancestors around the world, that they slowly started um, putting seeds in areas that and locations where they might stop by later on again in order to collect the grains, the seeds, or the roots, if you think about all sorts of roots and tubers. So this is a process that took place over long periods of time. Yet that does not explain why humans would not catch on to, like living around these areas faster. And here we have to think about what it actually meant to settle down and rely more heavily on these, like slowly domesticated plant resources, for example. You have to toil the soil. And if you think about hunter-gatherer lifestyle, it's a hard life, but at the same time, you hunt, and once you have food, that's it. You eat, and then you start foraging and hunting again once you're hungry again. So, like there's no need to, like work very, very hard. These hunting technologies were typically quite sophisticated already. So you would typically not necessarily starve to death. That was not necessarily true with the early settlements, because as you started relying uh, on these crops, like if you had a bad summer, all of a sudden you had nothing to eat, right? And you had to spend all this time um, toiling the soil, like preparing the soil to grow stuff. So it was hard work, much harder work than hunting and gathering. And what we can see from the archaeological record is these early humans that started settling down, their life got worse. They started, like their average height decreases. We had evidence that through, for example, the bone density, that their nutrition was not as good, because our hunter-gatherer ancestors, they would always, like have a very varied diet. So they would live at the edges between different food webs, different food sources. So you have access to different proteins, different carbohydrates, different nutrients throughout the year. Whereas as soon as you started settling down and have access to mainly one or two food sources, your nutrition goes down. And so, like you're less healthy overall compared to hunter-gatherers. And also another thing that started happening is, if you decided to settle down and like create these first settlements, like for example the ancient city of Ur in Mesopotamia, one of the first large settlements in human history, you become a really good target for nomadic groups that see all the grains that you keep for the next sowing season, or like the cattle and the livestock that you keep in order to survive the lean period of the year. That makes you really easy target for a raid. Like why would you go hunting and gathering if you can just like hang around these settled communities, and now and again when you're hungry just invade them and get some food. And this is what happened. So there was an increasing competition between groups, there was more violence, there was greater what we see in the archaeological record. There was an increase in fractures that seem to be related to basically human inflicted violence. So it was not a really like smart move if you really think about it. And even more puzzling, why would our ancestors do this? Because all of a sudden they live in these close areas, like more highly densely populated areas with livestock, and livestock are a perfect vector for disease development, and then these diseases can easily jump over to humans. And if you have all these humans living together, these diseases spread easily through these communities and make us, like really good targets for all sorts of parasites, infectious diseases, etc., etc. Whereas hunter-gatherers, they were typically living in smaller groups, so it would not be as good a target for all these diseases. And if a disease struck, typically they would just pack up and move. So as soon as like a number of people would be sick, typically groups would, the healthy members would start moving to a different area, and this is essentially, if you think about it, it's a natural kind of quarantine, right? So you remove yourself from those that are sick, and therefore you survive. And we have a lot of evidence that these pandemics ravaged and decimated human settlements. As long as we have a human record, going all the way back to the Bible, the Quran, etc., etc., we have all this evidence that these repeated waves of diseases, plagues, the Black Death, etc., etc., would devastate human settlements and really kill off sometimes thousands and thousands of people. So all these factors together, like make it hard to understand why people started living together. And as people started living together, these first cities, one thing that you see is they have walls. So you have these walled cities, and a number of people have argued that maybe these walls were as much there to keep these raiders out. I talked about the like being an easy target for like these raiders to extract your resources, but they may also have been just a very efficient way of keeping people in, to make people stick with these communities and inhibit people from running away and joining these raiding groups again. So yeah, all sorts of questions, but if you think about it, it's probably not that surprising that it took such a long time for this technology to take off. This technology of agriculture and like dense group living, which requires a lot of cooperation. And this is probably one of the big puzzles, because humans are one of the most cooperative hypersocial species. Like we were able to put some humans on the moon. No other animal has achieved that. And that achievement of putting somebody on the moon was the result of cooperating individuals, literally thousands, probably millions of individuals cooperating together, because you had to extract all sorts of raw resources. They need, for example, iron that needed to be smelted and further refined, then stored. You need to sell it on. Then this iron, or like, will be bought by somebody who sells it on to some technology company that may create some like tiny little thing that will be put into a computer that regulates the engines that now blast off this rocket carrying these people to the moon. And like, as you listen to this, you have all these kind of metal components in your headphones or in your computer that allow you to like project my voice to you. So like, these are incredibly complex interactions that require constant cooperation between so many different people, that it is very difficult to understand why should this actually happen. Because if we think about the principles of evolution, there is a premium on differential reproduction competition, which would actually mean that you should propagate your own genes, and therefore like not cooperate with others, because that reduces potentially your chance to pass on your genes. So Darwin, this quote from Darwin, um, clearly recognized the challenge that altruistic action actually makes from a natural selection perspective. And Dawkins, like with his selfish gene arguments, was also very clear that, like our genes should act in a selfish way that prohibit any kind of altruistic actions. So let's quickly talk about how biologists would think about differential fitness here, and what actually means benefits and costs. So first of all, outcomes of interactions are always measured in terms of fitness, which is actually having offspring. So, like having kids, passing on your genes, that is the important unit that biologists typically would look at. If we extend this, so for example, the article by Nowak makes it clear it can also be, not just genes, but also cultural information that is being passed on. So you can actually extend these models to cultural information. But now, what do they talk about in terms of actor benefits and recipient benefits? So if you act in a way that benefits you and benefits somebody else, then it's a cooperative action. Altruistic actions mean that somebody benefits, but you as the actor actually get harmed. So basically you would not pass on your genes, for example, so you would die, or you have a disadvantage that impacts your chance to pass on your genes to the next generation. There can also be selfish acts where as the actor benefits, a recipient is harmed, which should be essentially the status quo in nature if we would go with a generic natural selection approach. And there are also these types of behaviors where both the actor and the recipient are harmed, so these kind of acts of spitefulness. But here we really focus on cooperation, or specifically altruism, which biologists typically define as the individual acting in a way that will decrease the own survival chances but improve the survival chances of another individual. So how can you make sense of these behaviors, these altruistic acts? Why does it exist in nature, and how can altruistic behaviors evolve? And this is where Bill Hamilton comes in. So we talked about Hamilton as one of the social biologists because in a couple of essays in the 1960s, he was able to provide a theoretical argument and what would become known as the Hamilton rule to explain how altruism actually can evolve in biological species. He made the important observation, or he basically built on this observation from others, that kin selection can work in two different levels. One is direct selection, so you can pass on your genes, but it can also work through indirect selection, so where your relatives that are genetically related to you can pass on their genes. So inclusive fitness now is the combination of both direct and indirect selection effects. So for example, if we think about this, like a little prairie dog is dying, and during her long and happy life, this little prairie dog successfully raised a total of 10 little pups. And in addition, this little prairie dog, by performing all sorts of altruistic actions, like she helped to rear basically 8 additional offsprings, 2 of which would not have survived without her help, right? And so her altruistic acts, so alarm calls, have resulted in her having the equivalent of 3 more offspring. In terms of numbers of offspring, what is her direct fitness? So the kids that this little prairie dog had were 10, right? So because we have 10 direct offspring. The indirect fitness would be 5. So because she helped to rear, she helped her parents to rear 8 offspring, and 2 of which, like by providing extra food, which would not have survived without her help. And then through these altruistic alarm calls that basically you call out that a predator is nearby, right? So you put yourself, your life at risk of being like eaten by the predator, but at the same time you make sure that 3 of your kin actually survive. So this 2 plus 3 makes 5. So the total, obviously 10 plus 5 is 15. So inclusive fitness would be 15. And so Hamilton argued that we have to track all of these things in relation to each other. So we have the benefit to the recipient. So how many potential offspring can I pass on? We have the cost to the altruist. So what would be the cost if I act altruistically? What is the cost of not passing on my genes? And what is the degree of relatedness of the recipient of my action? And this can be worked out if you think about it. So your parents, they had a beautiful, like encounter, and 9 months later, like little Bill came along. So Bill carries 50% of his genes from the mother, 50 from the father. And so Bill and Karen, now they have beautiful encounter, and then Trudy comes along. So obviously Trudy again has 50% of her genes in common with Bill, 50% of her genes in common with Karen. If Trudy had a brother or sister, again, they would share 50% of their genes with Karen and Bill, and Trudy would also share 50% of her genes with her sibling. And so now we can also look at the relatedness across generations. So Trudy shares 50% of her genes with Bill, her father, and therefore, because Bill shares 50% of his genes with his mother, Trudy shares 25% of her genes with her grandparents. And we can look at all these kind of different relationships and work out how genetically related you are to these different relatives of yours. And so now we can put this into all these beautiful little equations, right? So if would you save your brother? Let's say we go swimming, and like your brother obviously is shares 50% of your genes with you. Now your brother goes like for a swim, and all of a sudden you see that your brother is being swept out by a current into the ocean. So would you help your brother? Right. So now we have to work out what are the benefits and costs to us. So, for example, your brother could have potentially 2 kids. So that are the benefits if you would jump into the water to try and save your brother. So your brother could potentially bring the possibility, the benefit for you to have 2 kids, which means part of your genes would be passed on. But there are also costs, because I might not pass on my genes, or you might not pass on genes. So there's the cost of 2 potential kids and the risk of dying. So assume you are a very strong swimmer. Obviously, like the risk of you dying is relatively low. So we could now work out all these different combinations, right? So R times, so the relatedness times the benefit has to be larger than the cost, or the genetic relatedness has to be larger than the cost versus cost to benefit ratio, or the relatedness times the benefit minus the cost has to be larger than 0. Right? So we can work through all these different examples here. So genetic relatedness times the benefits, so 2 kids, has to be larger than the costs, which is basically 2 kids for you times the risk of dying. So 1 is larger than 0.1, yes, you should jump into the water. And similarly, using this one, genetic relatedness, 0.5 has to be larger than 2 times the kids so that you might have times the risk of dying divided by the benefit. So 0.5 is larger than 0.05, sorry, 0.1. Again, oh sorry, yes, 0.05. Then again, that should make you jump into the river. And we could do the same thing again, 0.5, the genetic relatedness, times the benefits to the two kids minus 2 times the risk, the 2 because of the number of kids you might have, times the risk of dying. So all of this together is 0.9. Is larger than 0. So all these calculations basically rearranged in from the same equation show you should definitely jump into the water. So what about your cousin? Your cousin is much less genetically related to you, so it's 0.5 with your parents. Then your parents are correlated or are related to their siblings. About 50% of their genes are shared with their siblings. So with your uncle, you share 25% of your genes, and then uncle and aunt, their offspring, you share basically 12.5%. And again, 2 potential kids for your cousin, and the risk for you to die is relatively small, and you have 2 potential kids that you might not have if you jump into the water. But again, if we work out the equation, you should actually jump into the water because the ratio is still beneficial. Now let's look at the condition where we're having a look at your brother again. You still have the potential benefit of having 2 potential kids via your brother, but now you are actually not a good swimmer, so the risk of dying is much larger. And now what happens here in this situation, in all of these conditions now, if the risk for you of dying is much larger, so it's a 50-50% chance of you not making it, this, from a biological perspective, should make you less willing to help your brother because the risks are just too high, and therefore it's not worth it biologically. So this really explains how basically as the genetic relatedness goes down, the benefit must go up or the cost must go down in order for these fitness effects to be selected for greater altruistic acts. So this is kin selection. And as Dawkins noted, if we take the selfish gene perspective, so where we are seen as survival machines that are blindly programmed to use our selfish molecules known as genes, then like this preservation should actually lead to altruistic acts if it actually enables our genes to pass themselves on through helping other relatives. So this is the first example of how cooperation or altruism can evolve in nature. But is there more to offspring than that? So a lot of species actually live in some kind of symbiotic relationships where, for example, cleaner fish is a very good example, where this fish would be infected by parasites, and then these cleaner fish come along and eat off these parasites, but with the risk of being eaten by this larger predator fish. So why would this kind of relationship develop if this smaller fish actually is at risk of like not surviving by performing these altruistic acts on the larger fish? So this is where the work by Trivers, like when he was still a grad student, using a gene eyes perspective, came in, and he was able to explain how this could actually happen. So 2 major conditions for direct reciprocity to emerge. The first one is the costs have to be relatively low, right? So if you have and the benefit's relatively high. So if you have these parasites um, living on you, it's actually a huge benefit for you to get another fish um, to eat those parasites off you. So the benefit is relatively high. It increases your fitness because you're healthier. You can pass on your genes more easily, and the costs for you are relatively low. And importantly, there needs to be a probability of another encounter. So what changes now is this coefficient W, so the probability of another encounter, instead of genetic relatedness as in kin selection, as discussed by Hamilton, right? So the probability of another encounter makes the emergence of direct reciprocity possible. So the higher the probability to return a low risk favor with high benefits, the higher the fitness, and the more likely it is actually to for altruistic actions to evolve over time. So really the important is, the more likely it is that you will interact with somebody again, the more likely it is that altruistic acts will slowly emerge um, in a species. So this is direct reciprocity. But you can obviously see some potential problems, right? Because you could just say, "Yep, sure, I will see you again," and then disappear into the sunset and never show up again, right? So this system is very ripe for being exploited by free riders. So how to get around these cheating mechanisms? One mechanism is that the groups have to be relatively stable. The second one is you have to have relatively frequent opportunities for altruistic acts, and the relations have to be symmetric. So there is no uh, unsymmetric, asymmetric social hierarchy relationships. And what can facilitate direct reciprocity is actually a punishment of cheaters. But you have to have direct reciprocity happening first, and then this can be reinforced through punishment. Punishment itself cannot lead to the emergence of these direct reciprocity relationships. A third mechanism, and this is probably one that becomes quite important if we think about the early emergence of human societies, is actually the power of reputation, or indirect reciprocity. So what is now at stake is your reputation. So you may help somebody else, right? So there again, costs and benefits of you helping somebody else, and that will increase your reputation in a specific social system. So this is often related to, for example, gossip, or the alliances that you might be able to create based on your reputations. And in group settings, reputation becomes very important, especially if you think about, again, like our ancestral groups. As you are able to, for example, share food with, for example, your partner, or like a small group of others on a regular basis, that increases your reputation and therefore makes you a higher status member, which allows you to again attract stronger coalition partners, which allows you to extract resources more efficiently, and therefore you are able to distribute them more widely, etc., etc. So reputation is a very important mechanism that can explain why altruistic acts can emerge in social groups that track reputational status. Another one that can potentially explain altruistic acts and why they emerge in biological species is through a so-called network reciprocity. So what happens here is individuals may team up with each other and form networks of altruistic relationships. So like this chap here will help this chap there, which will help that chap there, and so you form a small network, or these three individuals here. Sorry, so this chap here cooperates with this one, cooperates with that one, cooperates with this one. So these three neighbors here in this network collaborate with each other, which allows them to reap benefits through, for example, sharing resources, sharing information, which increases their fitness. So this will allow, like small groups of individuals to share important information, share important resources, and therefore has a benefit for these three individuals. But this type of reciprocity breaks down as the number of neighbors increases. So if you have larger and larger networks, then the probability of this network reciprocity to work for the emergence of altruism decreases somewhat. But it can explain why, for example, in Homo erectus groups, like as these kind of alliances and coalitions started emerging with food sharing, like in protection groups within these larger bands, that probably could be a good model to explain the emergence of these altruistic networks in these ancestral groups. And then, of course, we have group selection. I already talked about the fact that, like our sedentary ancestors, like as they slowly started to move into agricultural modes of production, they were really sitting ducks and could be easily rated by other groups. So what we have now is we have two different mechanisms. So within groups, defectors within groups where you have both cooperators and defectors will most likely over time outcompete cooperators because defectors have no costs and they benefit. They contribute no benefits, but they also have no costs. So overall, they might be better off. Cooperators, of course, then on the other hand, they have costs, and they may not reap the benefits, right? But then, so at the individual level, defectors would be better off. At the group level, though, cooperative groups are better able to compete with mixed groups or groups, like based of non-cooperative members. And so cooperative groups, if they manage to share their resources and defend their territory, for example, they should be able to survive better and outcompete groups that are less strongly affiliated with each other and less cooperative with each other. So you have two different directions of selection. At the individual level, defectors have an advantage. At the group level, cooperative groups have an advantage. And now, as you can play this through with simulations, people have found that there's a relatively simple equation that can capture that under a number of conditions, which is if the benefit to cost ratio if there's a larger benefit than cost for cooperation, the altruistic acts will emerge over time if the number of groups M increases, so this ratio will go down, or the groups are relatively small. So basically, larger groups will typically not survive so well unless you have a large number of groups, an even larger number of groups that keeps that ratio down again. Or you have to have small groups and relatively fewer competing groups, right? So it's this ratio of relative group size to number of competing groups that now drives the system to develop towards altruism. And this is here, for example, like representation of some raiders or pirates in a Southeast Asian context to basically demonstrate as these human groups settled down around the world, if they were competing with other nomadic groups and had to defend their territory and their accumulated resources, they by necessity now had to cooperate more in order to survive in this competition across different groups, right? So the fact that people started settling down and had to cooperate with each other now in order to toil the fields, collaborate with each other to, around harvest, around the taking care of animals, and defend against these other competing groups that constantly threatened to invade you and steal your resources, automatically that shifts cooperation into this kind of group selection mode and makes it necessary for groups to cooperate with each other more in order to survive. So most likely the settlement, as people started settling in specific areas, drove the pressure towards altruistic acts to evolve via group selection. So basically, selfish genes, yes, but there's widespread altruism, and there are a number of different reasons of why this actually could happen. On one hand, through inclusive fitness, which probably does not explain human cooperation on that large scale that we see today very well. Second one, direct reciprocity, could very well explain altruistic acts at a very local level. Indirect reciprocity, so the emergence of reputation, probably a very important explanation for the emergence of altruism and cooperation in human groups. And then the network reciprocity, at least as far as back as Homo erectus groups, as we had discussed with Williams and Fenshake's argument, probably a good explanation of why these kind of network cooperative coalitions would emerge in Homo erectus groups. And group selection, probably a pretty good explanation of why sedentary groups, once they started settling down, had to cooperate more with each other in order to ward off the raids and the competition for more nomadic groups. So, this one, I just want to finish off here with a quick quote from Dawkins again, because Dawkins is always set as this kind of ultimate kind of gene's eye person, the selfish gene argument, right? But he is also very explicit about the fact that this does not mean that we have to be selfish, right? Because the fact that we understand what is happening with our selfish predispositions at least gives us a chance to counteract that, and we can teach ourselves altruism and generosity and set up systems that facilitate that, which no other animal could have done so, right? So it's quite inspiring if you think about it, that the ability that we have through our cultural technology to overcome some of these biological mechanisms is something that no other species was able to do so. And let's come back to humans. So another thing that happened during that time, so we are now moving towards between 4,000 and 3,000 years ago. So there's first evidence of record keeping. So people started developing proto writing systems. And we often think about writing, beautiful, like art, novels, stories, etc., etc. Most likely, though, the early emergence of records of writing was a tool of social control, because a ruling class could actually keep track of who was within a specific area, who owned what, who was due to pay tax at what time, etc., etc. So writing actually, at the most likely explanation for the emergence of writing was that it allowed a more efficient control of resources by a ruling elite. So this is something that we have to remember, that again, something might emerge and then can be co-opted for all sorts of other reasons, but it might actually have been driven by specific necessities to regulate social life, rather than all these other beautiful cultural phenomena that would later be able to be expressed with that cultural technology. And we have all sorts of evidence that now, like social relationships became much more hierarchical. So here are, for example, some tombs from the Persian Empire. So we have much stronger social stratification now that was not there during our hunter-gatherer ancient life history. So people became there was much greater exploitation, a much greater um, like social hierarchy that made life, actually, if you think about it, much more unpleasant, because unless you were at the top, like life became quite miserable. And there's good evidence that in most of the early civilizations, because like working in the fields was so time consuming and so monotonous, it actually had a huge negative toll on these populations. And most likely all of these early civilizations had some kind of version of unfree labor service, or some version of slavery, because the work in the fields, the work in these stone quarries, for example, to create all these amazing early structures, that was that was hard work, and you had not enough people around to do this work. So most likely you had now also these raids from these city centers out into the nomadic areas to capture unfree laborers or slaves in order to bring them back and now work on the field. So you started to have kind of a bidirectional um, war and raiding process. But on the other side also, the emergence of agriculture opened up a very important feedback mechanism on our own genetic um, tools, on our own genomes. As you remember, we talked about it already. Um, Humans typically, historically, were not able to digest the lactose that was kept in that was in milk. Yet, as humans started to domesticate cattle, suddenly the ability to digest milk later in life became advantageous, because it would give you access to nutrients, it would give you access to liquid, which would be beneficial. And if you were able to do this, you would be able to pass on your genes, because you would be better fed, you would be more likely to survive in specific environment. So the ability now to digest milk, as milk became available through the domestication of cattle, had this huge feedback process onto our own genes. And so, we have this gene culture coevolution, where in independent populations around the world, as humans started using this cultural technology of domestication of cattle, to emerge repeatedly on the same gene. So this is a very potent example of how our cultural changes, so the adoption of agriculture and and like extraction of, for example, milk from cattle, would lead to like genetic changes that were driven by our changed cultural technology, so gene culture coevolution. Furthermore, like we often talk about domestication as something that we do on other animals, but there's now increasing evidence that we actually domesticated also ourselves. So there's evidence, for example, that over time um, our brains became slightly smaller again over the last couple of thousand of years, as we started moving to living in larger collectives. And Brian here, he kind of summarizes this in annual review of psychology paper as the kind of survival of the friendliest. So this kind of self-domestication and selection for pro-sociality. So again, talking about this kind of mechanism for increasing altruistic cooperative acts in our human lineage. So he argues that we self-domesticated. So like people that were friendlier, were more tolerant, were more pro-social, were more likely to pass on their genes. So would like have larger groups of friends that would support them, and therefore would be better able to gain resources to support your offspring, and therefore those genes would be passed on. So there's an increasing tolerance and pro-sociality. There's some evidence that there's increased serotonin and oxytocin expression or pathways in the human brain, because we know serotonin and both serotonin and oxytocin are related to like pair bonds, either from mother to offspring or between humans, and to building strong, stable relationships. And there's evidence that these pathways were affected over the last couple of thousands of years as humans started living together. There were also increased or expanded developmental windows. So kids were, like less independent over longer periods of time. So as we had discussed already, this is something that started off probably with our common ancestors, with the chimpanzees, but like the ability to learn, and therefore like the larger cultural knowledge that would need to be accumulated in order to be a well-functioning adult required a longer developmental period. So the extension of childhood and adolescence as a period of apprenticeship is an example of this evolved, like selection for pro-sociality and higher cultural complexity. There's also some evidence that our faces changed, so they became less aggressive, more childlike over time. And also there's an increased selection for cooperative communication. So changes, for example, in our eyes, so the white areas of our eyes became larger, so it would be clear where we direct our communication. It would show more clearly our intentions. So all these changes are important for increasing cooperative communication and cooperation overall. So self-domestication, probably an interesting process that happened over the last couple of thousands of years as we started living in these larger collectives and started like living depending on collective work, even though it was immediately had an immediately negative health impact on us humans. Overall, it allowed a larger number of humans to actually pass on their genes, and therefore it kind of this technology caught on eventually and set this process up for larger and larger collectives of humans to live together. But this also creates challenges, and this is the last section for this week: the challenges of living together and the dynamics of the demographic dynamics in large, complex societies. And this is really where Peter Turchin's cultural evolution approach is important to look at. He published a book about a couple of years ago on what he called a structural demographic theory of history. The book Ages of Discord specifically focuses on the patterns in the US, but he has worked on this in a number of historical regions around the world, and he has demonstrated these general shifts and changes in human societies over the last couple of thousands of years. And let's have a quick look to put a little bit on a dampener on this kind of whole positive notion of increasing progress, happiness, and peacefulness. What he argues is that there are cycles of over over population and therefore conflict and warfare that are followed by areas by periods that are more peaceful and friendly because there are enough resources to go around. So for example, here is a chart from China where he shows these kind of cycles of violence where like there's increased political instability, people die, and then these are followed by periods of relative peacefulness and lower death rates overall. And for example, in American history here, for example, there's this green line of popular well-being where resources are more equally shared in all the in the population. And then there is something called elite overproduction, and I will explain that a little bit more in a second. But it is essentially, like conflicts that are basically going down as the population is better off, but as the population well-being goes down, the probability of conflict among the elites is going up. So what this is all driven by is overpopulation. And you may remember our good old friend Robert Malthus, and this is exactly where Turchin starts off with, because he argues that there are these kind of resource population growth dependent kind of interactions. So as resources are available, populations start to grow, and like more and more people like start reproducing, so you have these kind of youth bulges, and then the resources are not sufficient over time to keep up with the growth. And so what happens is, on one hand you have these elites that are in charge of it, and as now more and more people live in an environment, more and more people with economic access try and like get to that elite status within a society, which now of course the elite tries to restrict the access of these upcoming individuals to join their elite status, and so basically the elite is pushing back. On the other hand, the greater availability of consumption goods typically means that the elite now is competing within each other in order to increase the signaling that they are really in an elite status. So you basically have two mechanisms. As the population grows, more people try and increase their social status, so try and move up in the social hierarchy, and also in the elite there's a greater competition to keep moving up. But as you can imagine, most of the times elite status is relatively limited, because in most societies you have only just one king, one emperor, or like you have one president or a small number of council members. So like you can't increase the elites infinitely. And so what now happens is these increasing number of people competing for resources that are increasingly depleted, so this is basically the Malthusian trap again, try and move up up towards higher social status, and the elite is pushing back, and then you have this kind of clash at some stage when the production the available resources are not sufficient anymore to keep up with this kind of demand. And so what Turchin argues is that there's this cycle of about 25 years between the period where like parents are very happy, things are going well, so that's why you have kids, and about 25 years later these kids now also want to have the good lifestyle of their parents and compete with each other to get all these higher the higher social status, and realize, oh my god, there's not enough space for me actually to move up. and the elites are competing with each other. There's an overexploitation of resources. Resources go down. So essentially what happens here now, the popular well-being goes up and elite overproduction goes up. So basically competition in the elite goes up. The elites may fraction, there might be infighting, and so overall you have the possibility for example, civil unrest. You have the possibility of civil war where elites basically now mobilize certain segments of the population to fight on their behalves in order to get access to this elite status. So you have all these kind of intrigues, attempts to overthrow the monarchies or the leading councillors, etc., etc. And this comes to a head clash, and then as the social structure disintegrates over time because of these elite fights, the pressure is being taken off. Probably the social structure is interrupted, and what happens now is everyone is worse off. But as this happens, so the elite overproduction goes down, more resources become available again for a larger number of people, which is basically the next generation, right? So one generation where like the sons and the daughters of the previous generation fighting for higher status, it comes to a clash. They don't have kids at that moment, so there's a smaller population in the next time around, and so more resources are available again for their offspring. So therefore the popular well-being goes up again. It's really rosy. People, like that generation starts to have more kids again, and so on. And so what he showed was that this cycle has been happening for at least the last 2000 years in all the kind of major social systems around the world, which is, if you think about it, not a particularly positive description. So what I want to finish off here with is basically human evolution is really complex, and it's not linear, as we have seen just with the last example. Again, even cultural evolution is a non-linear process, so there are constantly these demographic changes, economic changes, social changes that can create all sorts of trajectories that lead to social unrest, civil war, overthrowing of ruling elites, etc., etc. At the same time, many fundamentally human traits have a long evolutionary history. So we talked about adaptation, genetic adaptations to changing environmental conditions. We had talked about that some of these traits may have enhanced fitness in the past, but may not anymore. So these are past adaptations. At the same time, humans, especially over the last 5,000 years or so, are ultra social. There's cooperation at mega scales, and we looked at some of these mechanisms that may have explained why we have these large-scale cooperative structures, in particular through selection at a group level. And so cultural evolution is really important to understand where we are today, and we will spend quite a bit of time in the rest of the course talking about some of these mechanisms of cultural evolution, but also the cultural changes that happened have fed back into our genome. So there has been selection for certain genes. So we talked, for example, about self-domestication. We talked about the gene cultural coevolution of, for example, the lactase tolerance in humans. And so this is an interacting, a very dynamic process that is highly complex. This is a very exciting, dynamic, and expanding field of research, which I think has a lot of scope for us to provide insights of how we happen to be here today with the kind of both genetic but also cultural and social structures that we have today. And it's really up to us to make sense of these patterns. As I talked about Turchin's work, you could think of it as a very pessimistic, a very negative outlook on human nature. But I think, again, using that quote from Dawkins, and like paraphrasing that a little bit, by being able to understand these phenomena and understanding of why these mechanisms or these trajectories have happened in the past, that gives us power to actually change that. So it is in our hands of what we could make of our future, and it's ultimately in your hands because you're the next generation that has to use this knowledge in a productive way to avoid some of these mistakes and change the dynamics that have shaped human history over the last hundreds and thousands of years.